Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Tank assistant editor Nell Whittaker talks to director Fridtjof Ryder about his film Inland, shot when he was only 20.
There's so much writing on the rural or like art about the rural, which is, you know, is this like either like this very bucolic place like the Lake District and this rugged, untouched landscapes, or it's like this kind of folk horror, and I feel like the film sits in between in the way that the suburbs kind of sit in between. And
that's cool.
There's this like incursion always of the forest. It reminded me at some points of The Road, actually, you know, the Cormac McCarthy novel. You know, similarly in that book, the mother is this absent presence. And then it made me think that there was a kind of like post-apocalyptic sense almost to the relationship between, you know, like the boy and the man also being the man and Dunleavy. And I was kind of wondering about apocalypse really, and how like particularly questions about climate and, you know, in the incursion of industry into natural spaces, you know, that sense of threat. Like how did that feature as well in your putting together the film?
I mean, that's, again, it's kind of funny because Mark, for instance, talks so much about the return thing, you know. So it's like the return. It feels like the return, like he's getting back. I think he was even saying in the other interview, like he's getting back to trying to find something, like trying to get back to the state before. And I guess it kind of like it's like the Cormac McCarthy stuff, like you know, he got very obsessed with the Kukule problem and the stuff with like the Ouroboros snake and the scientists who like couldn't work out a mathematical problem and then fell asleep and saw the Ouroboros snake, like the circular snake, eating its own tail, and woke up and realized like, oh, it's a ring. And the idea of the subconscious being older than language, and the subconscious kind of preceding language and knowing the answers to the things that you've lost somewhere along the way, that you've lost the answer to. And it felt like it was kind of that, like it wanted to keep the film like a circle somehow. It's always open, and almost like you could watch it, God forbid you'd want to, but you could watch it on repeat, and the ending kind of spins back round to the beginning, even just in terms of the mother missing and then the son going missing. And the film just sort of being about the processing of getting to that point, like working out how you know what the end point is, and you watch him find his way there, and then it's a circle and it's kind of explained, but it's still, the questions are still exactly the same. And so I guess, the apocalypse stuff felt really present in the reading, just in reading loads and just being like a fairly young person and wondering what the fuck you're supposed to do and what your relationship should be to these things. How you can even relate, how you feel like you can help in any way, how you feel like you can make any difference. And not in any way that I'm expressing that directly in the film or was trying to, but I feel like there was a lot of feeling really confused and feeling really like, feeling the sense of apocalypse and kind of hoping in the return you can both get the feeling of what is resolved at the end of the film is not necessarily good or bad, you know, him being lost in the forest, but you can kind of follow him through it and you can follow him to that point. So I guess it was like trying to keep it open, wanting to the whole time have this sense of like, everything is too much and everything's too crazy, and it's only by getting back to literally being fucking naked and going into the forest that it gets quiet.
I think it's super interesting, the idea of it being on a loop, because I mean the film starts with him being discharged from some kind of medical facility, and we presume because he's had some kind of breakdown. And then that ending, you know, it looks like a breakdown too. I mean, like he's not well. I think that's another like something I love about the film is that it's not triumphant in that sense of return to nature. It can be kind of desperate as well. But yeah, I mean, on that sense of desperation as well, like the politics of the countryside as well, I think is something as well that are kind of glimpsed at, not addressed directly, but you know, that moment where you find out that his friend has left to has gone to London to become a museum guard, I think is such an interesting moment, because, you know, the metaphor of it is like, you've got that kind of classic sense of escape from the country to the city, and he's going to be like adjacent to culture, but he's not being a creative.
Right, yeah.
And so it's that idea of like the depopulation of the countryside into these like precarious jobs. So I was wondering about the kind of political dimensions of the community and the lives that are being described.
Again, that was very, like, that's a lot sort of sense experience and personal stuff. And, you know, like, I'm lucky both my parents are artists. I had kind of an upbringing that was very open in terms of what you want to do or where you want to go. And the countryside felt like, you know, they wanted me to grow up there because they felt like it was probably a better alternative to, I mean, I was born in Berlin and grew up a bit in Berlin, and I think it was like, it's just great to be in the countryside. So it wasn't like I'm generations down from in Gloucester from a long line of farmers or something and then trying to escape. But having said that, you see a lot of people. There is a sort of exodus and there's a really interesting mix in your friends from home of, you know, everyone's like, fuck it, I have to go to university, and everyone's going to Bristol and everyone's going to London or whatever. But there are also sort of the people who fall between that and are like, actually, no, I want to stay here. Or my dad, like one of my friends whose dad's a farmer and who's just sort of working in Tesco's and Techies or whatever in Gloucester, and just stayed when everyone else left. And like there's a real strangeness in, like, for me coming back home now is, you know, it's like a choice, and you go back home and you spend time with your parents and friends, but sort of the people who are always there and the people who stay versus sort of all of us abandoning ship and running off and going to cities or whatever and wanting to get into arts related jobs or whatever. It was way more personal. It was that, just always finding that dynamic of going back and meeting friends who kind of like stay in Gloucester as being really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a kind of collision of worldviews in a way, in that, like, there's the kind of liberal consensus is that to stay is to be a failure, which means that, you know, you see these rural areas be kind of hollowed out.
Yeah.
You know, and the problem of second home ownership, particularly in the south, where you end up with villages with no schools because people don't have children. I mean, like, this kind of idea, I think that the film plays with really well is this idea that a space has an identity, but that those relationships between the people there are very fraught.
Yeah.
Yeah, just, I mean, something else I also wanted to talk about was, because I also grew up in the countryside, and something I loved about the film was the amount of time spent in cars. It's so much in a car.
Yeah. And there was way more before we cut it all out. Yeah, it was all fucking cars.
There's loads of driving, and he sleeps in a car.
Yeah. And
I think that's something that, you know, like you were saying, it's a kind of sense memory for me, really, is driving, especially as in your late teens. And I was thinking that, you know, in the kind of like boon period of nature writing, there was a lot of discussion about walking and, you know, Nan Shepherd being this kind of like icon of walking, and this idea that walking is to like stitch yourself into the landscape.
Yes.
And then I was thinking that, you know, my experience really of being in lots of these landscapes was in a car, which is like this kind of, can be like a kind of glass box. And I was wondering about I mean, like, was that something you were sort of thinking about through the filming? Was this kind of like the car as a kind of eye almost? As a kind of mode of perception as well. That's
really good. Yeah. I don't know if as directly as that, but yeah. The idea of, and even again, just like the split thing again, like the practicality of being like, I'm setting something in my hometown and some of these places are real and you want the sense of going between them to feel real to the people who are from there.
Yeah.
There's almost that as one thing. And then the other thing of sort of, same. So many memories and so much time, and like mates getting first cars, like teenagers in cars, someone driving a bit drunk, stuff like that. Like that is really strong. And with parents, you know, driving like out somewhere to a site or whatever for a weekend, or the feeling of being in this car going through all this space, and the idea of, you know, could stop suddenly somewhere. And it was like that because we would go to the Forest of Dean or whatever for the weekend. Just little nooks, car parks in the middle of nowhere, and you're just driving through this expanse of green, and then you stop somewhere and you get out and you walk into it, and you kind of have no idea where you are, and you're just orienteering yourself by the car. And also just the bottleneck of it in terms of like the feel of the film, sort of the idea of like the car always becomes the like becomes the lead up to the crescendo. It's like the car becomes like, you start with him in that space and he hits the owl, and that's the beginning. And it's sort of this thin space opening out into the nature and into the world, and then doing the same when he's sort of driving more and more later, and it's when you're ramping up the tension. And it always felt really good, almost just like that in the edit. It became like a bottleneck for then the event, whatever it is, once you're out the car, to explode. So yeah.
And obviously, just thinking, Dunleavy's a mechanic. I mean, he's not like
Yeah.
He's not like a greengrocer or like a
that's true.
turnip farmer. And the other thing about the car, I guess, is that because there's lots of shots in the film where the reflection of particularly leaves on the pane, it has this sense of there not really being anything between the man and the woods at all, which is also, you know, it happens at lots of other points, I think, in the film. But that idea of like reflective surfaces and the lack of boundaries. I was wondering if you could just tell me about like how that, like, the loss of the mother instigates this kind of collapse of the psychic self.
Of the boundaries, yeah. And I mean, quite literally, I mean, you having said it now made me think, fuck, that's heavy-handed. Actually, just having literally the portrait with the reflection, you know, that's almost like, that's the first thing, him taping that up. It's sort of like, this is the MO of the film. And yeah, it kind of is that. It's like the reflective surface the whole time of, you know, of him in nature, and nature sort of throwing something back at him. And then him in the weird space with his mum, where it's throwing back some kind of reflection of her that's linked to the nature, and the statue, and literally the beginning of looking at the statue, and the statue being some kind of, something that's in the centre of the forest somewhere. Something you're trying to get to, but something that actually just reflects yourself back at you. Yeah, it's kind of the whole film. It really is kind of the whole film. Sort of like shout into the forest and see whether the forest shouts back. Yeah.
I think that's the thing about nature, the broad concept of nature is its broad indifference as well. You know, it's something that has always been a surface on which to project ideas. Yeah. Whether they're conservative, you know, like the green man is on the illustration for the coronation invite. But then also, you know, the countryside has always been like talked about in left circles as a radical space, place of like rural organisation. Yeah. I guess in either sense, the words aren't giving you a definitive answer. Yeah,
and I guess in that way, it's like it was like avoiding that imagery actually. That was kind of part of it. It's like there is imagery that is just so worn and so strong, and kind of like you said, gets salvaged and taken by whatever, by the left, by the right. Images like John Barleycorn, images like ideas of May Day, ideas of, you know, like the equinox, ideas of the green man, or these sort of like really ingrained ideas rurally. That was actually a really strong thing, was not leaning on, you know, like not literally having green man imagery in the film, like something in Men where it's playing, where it's reusing that. It felt like the forest should just be the forest, and your relationship to it is sound, is the soundscape, basically. The forest inside him with his body, and sort of him in relationship to the forest, but pulling out the markers or pulling out the stops that you would have for a folk horror film, where you would sort of drop the imagery and you're kind of like, okay, these are the connections you're making. It felt really like, can we do something with the forest where the forest becomes an entity and an organism that is maybe partly the mother, partly something else, and just do that sonically, just do that through sound, basically.
And how did that happen? I mean, almost technically, like how did that, like at what point did you understand that sound was going to be integral to that idea?
Yeah, that was from the beginning.
From early on. And then in terms of the creation of that soundscape, was that highly organised, or was that sometimes more sort of opportunistic?
Well, what's wild about that is its play. It's like because you can have a strong idea of images, like images so saturated and so obvious. And then for me, it was just learning sound. So we had like a really mad sound team who were like from the graduates from the NFTS, and who kind of had their own team. So Dominica, she came on board and she was like, I get it. And I've got like 4 people who'll do it with me. And then it was basically, the thing that's so cool about it is its play, because it's different from images, where images often feel like, you can write down an image, I guess, and it can translate quite directly into a film. because you have a sense of it. Sound is so weird. It's like, you go, this is the idea, this is the metaphor, I think this is how you should do it. You know, like the forest in his body or whatever. And often it's like 2 steps removed. It's like you do the thing that's obvious, or you do the thing that you wrote down, and it just doesn't work. It's like it grates too much, or it's too direct. And actually it was really mad finding sound. And sort of letting it find itself, like almost just throwing shit onto it. And then it's like, take that off, take that off, take that, whoa, what's that? And it's just this one sound. And it might be the most random sound. It's some like metal scraping bow sound, but somehow it just moves with the forest, and it just moves in time. And it was actually, so it's like a huge sense of play. And it felt like what they would do is you throw everything at it, and then you reduce. Like you kind of get to the point of simplicity through reducing it, rather than layering stuff up, which I always thought was really interesting. And it's like a single sound.
Really? Because I mean,
better.
It does feel like, it feels dense. I mean, at times it feels, you know, I guess that's why it feels like the sound of the forest, is because it does feel layered.
Layered, yeah. Yeah, the actual forest stuff. But for instance, like his body, you know, it was like, you have other stuff, and you have dripping, and you have moss, and you have all these other things on it, you know, like make him like a forest, and then it's like, actually just make him like a creaky piece of wood. And you get down to it, and obviously it's layered, and they're doing a load of stuff that I have no idea about even, but just from hearing, it's often like you get down to a point of what feels like simplicity, and you connect that, like if you look back at the script and you're trying to connect that to the idea you were writing, like it's kind of there, but it's like shifted 2 gears out. And I thought that was it was really cool that there's like not a direct correlation, and you kind of find it through play. Like you kind of find it through, this might be fun. Or like, I heard this, do you want to try that? I found that like it was kind of the maddest part, was like really learning how to have relationship with sound.
Yeah, because I think it can be deeply individual as well. I mean, just in terms of like what people are able to sort of screen out, or what they can't help but be attentive to, is it's not like visuals where people are broadly looking at the same thing, they're broadly seeing the same thing. I think the other thing to sort of maybe contrast to the scenes in or adjacent to the woods, there are these like highly stylized scenes in a kind of a bar, strip club environment. With this very dramatic lighting. I mean, how did the relationship between these 2 places sort of come about in the writing in particular?
So that's something that through the writing, or like through the making, and just following like what felt right, plus what you could do, plus the budget you have, plus how you're doing it. So that was, that was always, that space, and the meeting the mother in that space was always a thing. And the statues in that space were always a thing. But at the beginning, it was way more like trying to make that an in-between space, in that like has forest in it, and that is kind of partly forest, that space. And then it was kind of the same thing of like, how can we almost just like slightly unashamedly being like the thing that you can do with the money you have, and how you're doing it feeling the most striking, and that space feeling the most striking. And it kind of became the same thing about like just reducing it way back, and being like, how simple can we make this space? Can we literally just have it like a sketch? Like, can it just be black, nothing space with no dimensions, and just the markers? And then I guess the tables came in, and people sleeping at the tables, and kind of creating some weird sort of voyeur-looking element to it. But it was actually it became this thing of like, can we just make the space completely liquid and get away with it? Like it has no border at all. And you don't understand how you get in, and you don't understand what it is inside. And then as the film gets more and more, that's the first time, that's sort of the first big jump, you know, because before that it's almost like it could almost be a social realist film to some extent. You know, it could almost be a simple drama, and then you go into that space, and I like the thing of the first time you go in, you're like, what the fuck? You kind of get caught way off by it, because you kind of feel like you know where it's going with the whole night out and the boys stuff or whatever. And you then go into the space and you're like, whoa, what is this? And it would almost become like the first beat for everything else to start to, like you were saying, for everything to start to melt, basically, and the borders between stuff to melt. But the first time to be really shocking, so that the whole time you're watching the film, you're kind of like, where do I pitch this? Like, there was no way, it wasn't like I got the shot of him and it looks like he's thinking, and then he goes, and then he's in the space, and you're like, oh, this space is in his head. I like the idea of you walk into it like a wall, and you're just in this space, which you're sort of thinking, it doesn't really make sense. And then after that, it means the whole time, as it sort of degrades the whole way through, or as he sort of, I guess, loses touch to some extent, you're constantly open in like what level you're operating on, I guess. And that felt really fun to do, because it was going in being like, I don't quite know how that's going to work. I don't quite know. And that was edit stuff. It felt like that space was just the marker for like, okay, this film is going off into something else now. And it was fun for that marker to be really hard, because it meant everything was questioned from then on.
Yeah, it's like the first time it raises a kind of question over the protagonist's sense of perception.
Yeah.
With that idea that whether this space exists, or, you know, he's alienated from the people he's with, he's alienated by the environment to the extent that he's occupying a different space.
Yeah. It's going to sound weird saying it about that, but somewhere I liked, me definitely in the DP and some of the other people really liked the idea of being like, take everything that he sees like a fairy tale. Like, take it like like that's the reality. The reality is not like it's a psychological breakdown and he's in some strange blah 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 liminal whatever. It felt like there's something really felt really fresh and kind of like almost a bit innocent in take it all like he's walking through this fairy tale story, and then you operate on that logic. Like, you operate on the logic of things are actually interacting with him and they're real, like a Guillermo del Toro film or whatever, not there's a psychological thing happening. And that felt really fun, because then it was like the owl actually is his mum. Okay, cool. Like, and you go off that.
Yeah.
And it felt like if you buy the fairy tale, like if we thought the fairy tale was real, then somewhere the story has like a hopeful aspect as well. And the return is like, it really is a return. And it's not sort of like a, wow, he's so out of touch with the events that are going on. And that felt really fun, in the same way as like Lanny or whatever, the Max Porter book, just really liking the like, fuck it, make a story from the perspective of the Green Man and tie that to the reality of the village and the people. And just the Green Man's real. And that's like the beginning. Old Papa Tooth or whatever he's called. And then run with that. And that felt a way more interesting way around than sort of like give the audience the maybe this is a psychological space that you're going into, and then show us weird stuff. It felt cool to be like, no, I buy it, like from the making side, I buy it as a fairy tale, and I buy the story as a fairy tale.
I mean, I think it feels like magical realism in that that is realist in that you establish a set of structures that are kind of that you're responding to, and then they're unchanging, even if they're not what you'd recognise as like being part of like ordinary reality. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like those folkloric and fairy tale like imports, I think the film wears very lightly. You know, as you said earlier, it's not. You're not going to see like leaves erupting from his mouth. It's going to the sort of visual grammar is going to be much less obvious. Yeah,
it's not like Marquez or something. Yeah.
But I was thinking about something that kept coming up for me was like the idea of the changeling, which is that the idea that normally it's a baby, but it can be an adult. Yeah, has been swapped out. And
that's it. That was there. We thought about that. Yeah. No one's really talked about that one. Yeah, that was there. Yeah. I thought that was interesting from the beginning. That was more directly at the beginning.
Where do you see it in the film now?
I just liked the idea of, and it was weird. That was something me and Mark talked about loads, of being like maybe he's the other. Maybe he's like a child of the forest. Maybe he's like something the Green Man's like sent out that's inside him, like almost like a possession story. And that was really directly from talking about changeling myths, about stuff like that. And that was kind of then more in the monster sense at the beginning, where it was like maybe he's the thing. And then that, like, I guess got not eroded, but got sort of that was made more ambiguous. We really liked that idea, and I really loved that idea of like, he's the embodiment somewhere, like he's the little drop in the ocean, then he goes back to the ocean at the end, and maybe that is actually the home, like he's kind of come out from there and he's actually a part of that. And whether that's like a possession thing of like he's almost possessed by the forest. Yeah, no, that was really a thing from the beginning, and the sort of like the calling into the forest and the always coming back to the edge of the forest. The forest isn't scary, you know, like even on the first night, like he leaves, like he's staying at Dunleavy's house, at Mark's house, and then he drives up just to sleep at the edge of the forest and stuff like that. Yeah, that was really in there.
He's at that kind of borderland always.
Yeah, and he knows where he wants to go. Like, he knows where he wants to be.
Yeah. Mark Rylance obviously is extraordinary in it.
Thank you.
And I think his character is interesting because there's this scene close to the end where he's talking about how old he is, which is amazing because it's the kind of moment of real emotional breakthrough as well. Or not breakthrough,
when he has
maybe,
the breakdown. Yeah.
But maybe sort of it signifies a kind of getting to the end of things slightly. And that scene I feel again has a kind of lot of metaphorical import. He's talking about like becoming like craggy. He's talking about becoming lined.
Yeah.
You know, in a way that he's tree-like as well.
I'm the landscape. Yeah. And at the same time, I guess again the changeling stuff, because the eyes, the whole thing with the eyes the whole time, and I'm not scared of you anymore.
Yeah.
That's in there with the, you know, like actually he's this terrifying object. He's like a bit like a piece of glass. And Dunleavy's a really great character in that mould, in sort of like the old man of the forest, the old guy who's kind of he's peaceful somewhere. He's at peace with it and his place in it. And that was really fun. Again, from the Mark end, was like he doesn't quite know, like he's handling him with kid gloves, like he doesn't really know, he's kind of scared of him.
Yeah.
And then actually somewhere it's a bit of a point of freeing for Mark at the end as well, for Dunleavy, and sort of like I've said my piece and I've said the bit, and I mean the forest stuff, I'm not really answering it directly, like yeah, the stuff to do with landscape and him being part of the landscape, that just felt like, I don't know, that just came out in writing and felt like really embodied his character. And like they're kind of different sides of the same thing somewhere. Like Mark is comfortable and Rory's sort of like not sure at this point. He's not sure what his relationship to it is. But that, yeah, the coming home, and then also Mark actually being sort of, Mark in the end being the thing that he has to leave, with Mark being the sort of like, now at the point that I offer you peace is the point where he decides to leave. And that felt like the right place for the ending.
No, this should be my last question, but it's a straightforward one. I just was wondering, what was it like to shoot? I mean, deep in the woods.
It was mad. I mean, it was just home. So like a load of it was like, so the great house, all tangled up in forest, is the house of a teacher who we had at school, who the character is partly based on.
Oh, really?
Who just let us use the house because it was getting, funny enough, it was getting smashed down for new build flats. But they just let us shoot there. So there was a load of, because we all kind of reverse budgeted it so much, like no one on the crew was over like 30. It was literally just a bunch of us wanting to make something and kind of having an opportunity to do it. There was a lot of like, the people who are from Gloucester, there was a lot of like, oh yeah, I know that space. Or like, oh yeah, we shot a short film there when we were like 15, and that's like a cool corner. So the film kind of built itself up, I guess, like built itself up in relationship to the space actually as well, like in relationship to where we were. But shooting was so cool because we were just all on this old farm. Mark came down and was in a caravan, and we were all kind of camping or staying in like parents' gaffs nearby. And so it was like this contained, we were always around there, and in the evenings we had fires there and we would like spend time there. And it became like a troupe, basically. It became like a theatre troupe. And it was in COVID, and we were all sort of like, we were almost like an isolated bubble, all of us, which was great because everyone's just in it for like 3 weeks. You're just lost for like 3 weeks, and then you come up to air and you're like, what the hell have we done? But yeah, it really felt like just being around that house the whole time and being around that space, and that space is right next to the forest. And just, you're literally just driving to the different locations, and then you come back to the base at night You know, it'd be like you go out and you shoot a bit in the forest and you come back and you're back around that space. So it really felt like being a theatre troupe somewhere, being like a group. Yeah.
I think that comes through.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. I mean,
Thank you.
And yeah, it's a great film.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.